3 days ago, a ship disappeared. Not sank, not seized, disappeared. Its transponder went dark somewhere in the Persian Gulf, its last known position just 12 nautical miles from the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz, and as of this recording, nobody in the Western press is talking about it. That ship was carrying over 2 million barrels of crude oil. And the silence around its disappearance tells you more about where this conflict is actually headed than anything you will read in a mainstream headline today. Because here is the reality. What the world watched unfold over the past 72 hours was not a crisis that escalated unexpectedly. It was not Iran losing control. It was not a miscalculation or a moment of panic from a regime under pressure. What the world watched was a demonstration, a carefully sequenced, deliberately timed demonstration of exactly how much leverage Iran still holds, even after nearly 2 months of the most intense military and economic pressure applied to any nation since the Gulf War. And the reason almost nobody is reading it correctly is because they are still watching the wrong variable. They are watching the military strikes, the diplomatic statements, the oil prices. They are not watching the infrastructure underneath all of it, the invisible architecture that was built precisely so that a moment like this could happen. I want to walk you through something today. Not just what happened, but why it happened this way, why it happened now, and what the shape of the next 30 days actually looks like if you strip away the political theater and look at the structural mechanics underneath. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not just a waterway. It is the single most consequential 21-mile stretch of water on the planet. Roughly 20% of the world's oil passes through it every single day. That is not a statistic. That is a pressure point, a lever. And right now, that lever is being held by a country that the entire Western foreign policy establishment has spent the better part of a decade trying to neutralize, and it is still holding it. That fact alone should tell you something has gone profoundly miscalculated somewhere. Let me start with what actually happened, because the sequence matters enormously and it has been badly reported. 2 days ago, there was a brief window, roughly 18 hours, during which maritime traffic through the strait appeared to normalize. Ships that had been holding position began to move. Tanker tracking systems showed resumed flow. Markets reacted almost instantly. Oil dropped. Regional equity markets rose, and Western officials, including figures at the highest levels of American foreign policy, began signaling that a breakthrough was imminent, that the pressure campaign had worked, that Iran was standing down. The language used in briefings was deliberately optimistic. Words like resolution and framework were floated. There was even a social media post from the highest office in Washington that read in all capital letters, like a victory lap had already been taken. Then within hours, everything reversed. The Revolutionary Guard moved units back into their operational positions along the strait. Ships that had begun transiting stopped. Several turned around entirely. At least 3 vessels, including one flying a Greek flag and one flagged to India, executed complete course reversals after approaching the strait's entrance. A Panamanian registered tanker stopped transmitting its location altogether. And Iran's official communication shifted in language that was striking not for its aggression but for its precision. They did not call it a military response. They did not call it economic warfare. They called what the United States was doing piracy, maritime robbery, criminal interference with sovereign waters. That word choice was not accidental. It was legal framing. It was a message sent not to Washington but to every other government on earth that has ships in that water. Now here is where you have to slow down and think clearly, because the instinct when you see this sequence is to read it as chaos, as an unstable regime swinging back and forth under pressure. But that is exactly the wrong read, and I will tell you why. What you just watched was a probe and a response. Iran briefly allowed the appearance of normalization, watched how Western officials reacted, watched what signals were sent, watched what concessions were publicly previewed, and then used the information it gathered to reset on its own terms. It was not indecision. It was intelligence collection dressed as diplomacy. And if you understand that, the confidence with which Iran then reasserted control over the strait makes complete sense. It was not defiance for defiance's sake. It was a signal that said, we know exactly where your ceiling is and your ceiling is not high enough. So the question that actually matters is not whether Iran is being irrational. The question is where that confidence comes from. Because confidence in the middle of a sustained military and economic siege does not appear from nowhere. It has a foundation. And understanding that foundation is the only way to understand where this goes next. Over the last decade, while Western attention was focused on the visible dimensions of this conflict, the nuclear negotiations, the proxy skirmishes, the sanctions architecture, something else was being built in the background. Not announced, not celebrated, not even particularly hidden, just built quietly, layer by layer, in the way that genuinely consequential infrastructure always gets built. The first piece of it was financial. China began settling oil purchases with Iran in yuan, completely bypassing the dollar-denominated transaction system that the United States uses as the primary mechanism of sanctions enforcement. This is not a small technical adjustment. The entire leverage model of American sanctions depends on the fact that oil is priced and paid for in dollars, which means it flows through financial networks that Washington can monitor and freeze. The moment you exit that system, you exit the reach of that leverage. And Iran, with Chinese partnership, built a payment infrastructure that exists entirely outside of it. Oil still moves, money still transfers, the sanctions still exist on paper, but the mechanism that makes them bite simply does not reach this channel. The second layer was physical. The so-called shadow fleet, which sounds like a dramatic intelligence term but is actually a fairly pragmatic logistics solution, developed to move Iranian crude in ways that are genuinely difficult to trace. Transponders switched off, flags changed at sea. Oil transferred between vessels in international waters near Southeast Asian straits where oversight is limited. The crude reappears in the system labeled as originating from Malaysia or Oman, or a dozen other points of origin that attract no sanctions. On paper, Iranian oil exports look like one number. The physical reality on the water looks like something considerably larger. And the infrastructure that makes this possible has been refined over years to the point where it now operates with a degree of efficiency that was not possible even 5 years ago. The third layer was reserves. While global attention was on price volatility and supply disruptions, China was accumulating stockpiles. Conservative estimates put Chinese strategic petroleum reserves in the range of 900 million to well over 1 billion barrels. Much of that was purchased at discounted rates from sanctioned exporters, including Iran, during periods when those countries had limited buyers. The strategic logic is straightforward. If the Strait of Hormuz goes unstable and global oil markets spike, China's industrial base needs to keep running regardless. With reserves at that scale, China can absorb months of supply disruption without its economy seizing, which means China has no incentive to pressure Iran toward a settlement on American terms. Its own energy security does not require that outcome. And then there is the fourth layer, the one that changes the operational calculus most directly. Satellite imagery, specifically high-resolution commercial and military satellite coverage that gives Iran a level of situational awareness over the Persian Gulf and surrounding region that is qualitatively different from what it possessed even 4 years ago. Sub-meter resolution, near real-time updates, coverage of naval movement, base activity, logistics patterns across Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the broader Gulf theater. When you combine that with intelligence sharing arrangements that reportedly include Russian inputs, what you end up with is a country that is not operating blind. It knows where things are. It knows what is moving. And that changes the confidence with which it acts, because uncertainty is one of the primary things that forces a weaker power to be cautious, and that uncertainty has been substantially reduced. Put these 4 layers together. A financial system that neutralizes sanctions, a logistics network that keeps oil moving invisibly, reserves that insulate China from needing a settlement, and satellite architecture that removes the fog of war for Iranian planners. What you have is not a country under siege. What you have is a country that prepared for this siege years in advance and built a structure specifically designed to survive it. That is why Iran can close the strait, reopen it briefly, close it again, and do all of this without any visible sign of panic. The confidence is not bluster. It is structural. Now let me be honest about the strongest version of the counter-argument, because any analysis that does not take the opposing case seriously is not worth much. The American position is not irrational. There is genuine evidence that the pressure campaign is inflicting real economic damage on Iran. Currency values have deteriorated. Growth projections have been downgraded significantly. There are internal recovery timelines being discussed that stretch across years, not months. And the historical record does contain cases where sustained pressure produced genuine policy changes. Libya in 2003, certain moments in the South African apartheid era. The argument that consistent, layered, multidimensional pressure eventually forces a strategic recalculation is not baseless. It is grounded in precedent, but here is the flaw at the center of that argument, and it is a critical one. Pain and collapse are not the same thing. Pain means the system is under stress. Collapse means the system can no longer make independent choices. And everything we have seen over the past 70 days suggests that Iran remains firmly in the pain category, not the collapse category. Oil is still moving. Revenue is still arriving. Internal decisions are still being made by Iranian leadership, not dictated by external pressure. And the single most important indicator of that is the one we already discussed. Iran is not being forced into decisions. It is making them. That gap between being forced and choosing is precisely where this entire conflict is being decided. And right now, that gap exists because of the decade of infrastructure that was quietly assembled before any of this began. So where does this go from here? There are two realistic structural outcomes over the next 30 days, and neither of them looks like what Washington has publicly projected. The first is a negotiated framework that both sides can present as a victory to their domestic audiences. Iran gets some form of sanctions relief and asset access. America gets a formal agreement it can describe as a limitation on Iran's nuclear trajectory. The strait reopens in a stable and sustained way. Markets stabilize, and both governments claim they won. The important thing to understand about this outcome is what it does not include. It does not include Iran relinquishing its structural position in the strait. Even under a formal agreement, the Revolutionary Guard retains operational presence. Shipping continues to move through a corridor where Iranian oversight is embedded, acknowledged, real. The strait is open technically, but the balance of power along it has shifted in ways that will not appear in the treaty language. The second outcome is a prolonged stalemate. Neither side achieves its core objective in the near term. Iran cannot fully consolidate its position without triggering a response that overextends it. America cannot force a collapse that the underlying infrastructure is specifically designed to prevent. And so the conflict continues to operate at a level just below full escalation, with the strait functioning as a pressure valve that Iran opens and closes based on its own strategic calculation. Global energy markets remain volatile. Shipping costs stay elevated, and the world slowly begins to build around the strait rather than through it, which is itself a form of Iranian strategic success because it means the world is reorganizing its energy infrastructure around Iranian leverage rather than in spite of it. What you watched over the last 72 hours was not chaos. It was a preview, a controlled demonstration of exactly how this system works when it is actually tested under real conditions. And the most important thing you can take from it is this. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer just a waterway. It is a question about who gets to define the rules of global energy transit in the next era of geopolitics. And right now, that question does not have a settled answer. But the side that built its infrastructure for a decade before the question was even asked has a considerable head start.